the publication of government data. And for anti-corruption, there's a lot of work in this field on, developing these standards, like how should I publish government data. So there's about 3 standards for this, which is beneficial ownership. There's the open contracting data standards. That's for publication of government procurement processes. And also Puppet. Oh, no, sorry, not Puppet. Popolo, which is a standard for publishing things about, people, memberships, and organizations, and so on, which I often used that standard to also track what we call politically exposed persons, people like politicians, their spouses, their close business associates, and whatnot. So the general thing for open data is that governments will will publish a large set of these data sets. And if they're following these standards, we should be able to take these pieces of data and that's published by the government, and then be able to do some sort of analysis on it. So this example here, for example, is like if we have the people who own the details of ownership of people who own companies. So some countries like the UK are publishing it, and if I'm not mistaken, the US will start following next year as well, to get details on the ownership of businesses, or people or who's the beneficial owner, the people who are in control or will get the proceeds from the profits of those companies. And if you join it to the people that got awarded contracts, and if you know if some of these people are holding positions in government, for example, and they're giving it to their spouses and whatnot, you should be able to track or red flag warnings of issues of conflict of interest. And individually, each one of these standards is also able to do certain things as well. Unfortunately, when we're dealing with corruption, these things are not going to be easy. So there's a lot of pushback in terms of the availability of data, and depending on where you are, sometimes that data is not available, or for either technical or for political reasons. So it'll be nice if it's all there for you, but it's not going to be there easy. So when building an application, because I know that so much work has been done in the development of these standards, that it should be that if I build something on top of it, I should be able to use them for a variety of use cases. So a common way that I explain to people is like, why do we use, these standards or schema? Quite often when we're doing investigations or trying to corruption, we just get bits and pieces of random information. The other situation is that when you have like large data dumps, either by government agencies or, through leaks like Panama Papers. And when that happens, you get lots of data and it's kind of confusing. So if we have a clear schema on what we're looking for in terms of the pieces of data, we should be able to have a clear idea of what's missing and what we need to put in. And of course, if we have structured data, things become clearer. So this is actually a fascinating case from my country, Malaysia, involving the U.S. Department of Justice, banks, and swindlers. So basically, our prime minister went swindled about a couple of billion US dollars in a huge thing. So for those of you interested in this case, there's a book called $1 Billion Whale from the Washington Street Journal. So the problem here is that when we're trying to find these pieces of data in either politically or technically constrained environments, it's often lost and it's hard to get. So you get these bits and pieces of data. So what we've learned is that if we collect all these pieces of data, we're able to then make sense and use of it for a lot of different things if we are able to collect it. The challenge, though, of course, is that we've tried a few times in doing this. So the first time is like we're like, okay, cool. If we have an API and an editor for it, um, it should work. Unfortunately, that didn't work too well because it ended up having problems in terms of managing the database and so on, user accounts and so on. And we tried to do this again with and but this time using Django and a REST API. Again on the assumption that we're going to be able to if we build a robust API and database storage, that we're going to have a nice front end developed independently. That never actually happened. So we ended up having a lot of bugs on the API side, and um, the editing thing, the editing portion of the front end was all a lot of work and a lot of bugs as well. And we were not able to deal with a lot of the use cases that we needed to do for our work. And that was only for one. And and yeah, we couldn't really easily deal with adding random pieces of information as well. So um the third time I was like, okay, I had a small project and we had to do this quickly, and we had like we had to do this with like just one person. So the basically the few criteria that we had was that, okay, we want to able to implement these open data standards. We know that it will work, but we want it to be also easily extendable with additional fields. You need user-friendly editing. We need to be able to have features like full text search. And because a lot of this data is related to investigative journalism, it's not just a piece of data. We also need to have supporting content for it, such as documents, photos, and other sort of content types that attached to a piece of data. So something as simple as a company name. We will also want to store, for example, where did we get that company name? Was it a court document and what, or a company registrar document and so on. We also needed to have a publishing workflow, especially for a journalism use case. So sometimes certain things are not verified yet, or need to go covered by our editor. So we would need to have it private first, or publish only certain parts of it. Um, and of course, we need to use it in a lot of different ways, and we need to publish the data that we've collected, and we need a full featured REST API. And as I mentioned before, I don't have much resources to do these things, so needs to be able to be done, developed, and maintainable by like one person, possibly part time, um, so that it keeps going. So delving into that, just checking time for a little bit. Okay, so one of the things about Plone and developing a platform Plone is that we're able to have extensible, reusable schemas, fields, and views. So for that, direct dexterity and dexterity behaviors is extremely powerful and use for building these sort of things where you want to extend fields, join up different standards and whatnot. Um, Doing these sort of things, using strict schemas in their database is quite difficult, and it's quite problematic. So in Plone, for example, I would have one standard which has quite detailed schema on person, and another standard which also has quite a lot of duplicates for details on a person, but it has additional details on how to deal with politically exposed persons, like what kind of information that we need to deal in storing information on whether this person or is related, is a politically exposed person. So with dexterity, we're easily able to do this by making the PEP statement fields in one standard as behaviors, and then simply mix and match them using dexterity behaviors, either in code or through the web when we're organizing these things. So as a result, we have in Plone the person content type, but with fields from different standards in a flexible way. So this solves a huge problem that we had before, in which instead of building, three different databases, implementing three different standards, some of which are really complicated, and three different schemas, we can use the ability of Dexterity to, reuse common fields that are done across standards and do it in a much more rapid manner. So for example, in this case where I was implementing PEPs from open ownership, well, basically I only needed to add like 2 or 3 fields as a behavior, and then attach it to the Popolo spec person statement, which I already had. And that was all I needed to have without re-implementing the entire beneficial ownership standard in Plone. So this is an example where initially I just had for this person, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, I only had some fields like gender, his picture, and so on. And then using behaviors, I'm now able to add additional fields that I didn't think about, for example, like text residencies, the nationality. So a lot of these people involved in cross-border corruption, they sometimes have multiple passports, and then a U.S. citizen would be living in Panama, or a Malaysian living in London, and so on. So I'm now able to have these additional fields, and of course custom views, and either using Diazo on the theming side, as well as custom views on the content, allows us to really quickly create custom views, like within a few hours for less than that, depending on different ways that we need to present the data. So again, this is something that has reduced Plone time and time again, has saved me a lot of development work, because I can now reuse the same thing and quickly implement something without rewriting an entire project from scratch. Um, so in this case, these two examples, very different, very different projects and use cases in terms of the front end. But just by using Diazo theme and some custom views, I'm able to quickly change the how it looks for Kenya and for Malaysia, for with little code, and being able to reuse a huge portion of the platform time again. The other one I mentioned before was that surprisingly, it takes a lot of effort to make a user-friendly uh, editing front end, and this is something that Plone has done well since its early versions. It's extremely user-friendly for editing for users. So um, so one example is that in these standards, it's pretty hard. It looks complicated, and how do we make this more usable for the user? And using Dexterity and what Plone has built in, all we need to do is basically put the schema definitions, and we've got an easy user-friendly way to edit these things. And what's quite fascinating for me when using it this way was that initially the use case for these standards was for governments to publish. And it included a lot of very domain-specific information that was in the data schemas, but not so accessible for an end user. And one of the interesting things about putting this schema into a UI for editing it was that it actually exposed a lot of guidance for journalists and researchers to actually fill in data or look for data on a specific domain that they may not be familiar with. So, for example, I'm not an expert on beneficial ownership, but by just adding the schema in Dexterity and then the hints in the description fields, I'm now able to say, it's like, oh, okay, look, this company, has it been controlled? What is beneficial ownership, and so on. And it makes it a lot easier for me to research and enter data um, for domains that I'm not familiar with. So it now makes these very domain specific information accessible to a wider audience. And it's just basically the Plone interface for editing that makes it less scary for people working with data. Um, Other amazing things that are built in on Plone that is, for example, that it's not that we assume is just there, but it's not in a lot of other editors. For example, relationship fields actually looks up searchable text index, and that is amazingly useful when we're building things for data entry. So, for example, when I'm doing an investigation, for example, or researching a corruption topic, quite often I can't always remember who that person is, but I can remember certain things like, the cases or something that's known. So, for example, in Malaysia's case, the prime minister's wife um, had a penchant for buying these expensive, what's terms, Birkin bags or something, which are basically like $20,000 handbags. And if I couldn't remember her name, because the handbag brands are in the notes, I could just type, for example, Birkin, and it would just show up with her face. And this is a standard feature in the Plone relationship field. And it is super useful for, or let's say I'm investigating something that's related to an oil pipeline. I could just type in oil pipeline, and any notes, companies, and people that are associated with it that have their text index will show up. And it makes investigations really fun, especially for things that are not easily visible when you're just looking at documents. The other standard feature of Plone that's super amazing is, again, the the full text search ability of it, in terms of when you upload documents and content. Um, so so whereas most just kind of open data platforms just publish data, because in Plone we're able to attach documents to it. We can add files, we can add images, and so on. Um, and using collective document viewer and the right dependencies, we're able to do a full text search on all these documents that we add. Plus, as I just shared in the previous example, these things then show up as additional hints when you're looking for something. So not only am I just collecting data, but I can just search for a whole lot of different things. So this offshore company, for example, um, all the documents that I've uploaded show up when I'm doing the search to it, even when I'm looking at something else later and I can't remember about it. Again, this is something as a feature of collective document viewer. Quite often, a lot of documents that we get are just scanned, sometimes leaks or camera phone images and whatnot. And the ability to just upload an image or a PDF that's scanned and have it all OCR'd and searchable text, again, is another, amazing feature that's just there. I just had to just install an add-on. Again, things that are taken for granted, in building this front end, before when we fail, that is just part of Plone. You have things like security for fields, the management to access. You have versioning built in. So sometimes when we're investigating, we have multiple updates to it. Sometimes we need additional clarification and so on. And versioning is just built into Plone. You don't have to do any of this. Again, simple things like managing users, roles, who has access to what. This is all already built into Plone. So something that might take, a month of work to get it all right in Plone is just a given. And it's pervasive throughout the entire system, right? So you don't have to worry about data being leaked and so on if the permissions are, if you didn't check for permissions correctly. Another feature about using Plone as a open data storage is that you can also use the content management features to create arbitrary tags and collections. Um, this seems straightforward if you're from a content management background, or used to content management, but in open for data, this is extremely valuable. So what I mean by this is that um, when the data schema is extremely rigid, when something's random or arbitrary, you can't easily implement it unless you go back and rework those schemas and add these additional fields and whatnot to be able to have those use case. But with the content management, for example, we could just tag a whole bunch of different things, and then have a collection. And then now we're able to get, we're able to query them on this arbitrary tag without actually adjusting any of the schemas and whatnot, so that, the query would show these things. So it's been extremely useful for random use cases. For example, I had a bunch of politicians, and we need a lot of them actually have fake degrees and whatnot. But this is not something that's built into any of the data standards. So, with Plone, we could easily get a query for them if I, for example, just quickly add a tag for it. So we can actually get open data on people with fake degrees without modifying the schema. Let's see, going for time. And then, of course, the most powerful part about Plone. So one of the challenges that I had Plone before was that, it was kind of monolithic. You built everything in Plone. All your databases in Plone, all your views are in Plone, your web application is in Plone. But the power of, uh, but but people want to use the data that we've captured in Plone for all sorts of different things. You want to do fancy visualizations and whatnot. And the built-in Plone Rest API has basically solved this problem, because we now, while we're building all these kind of content types and schema, we already immediately have a rich API that allows queries, that allows us to export data, and allows to build other applications or visualizations for data journalism. So again, without me doing any development whatsoever, I immediately get a powerful REST API that's robust and has everything that I just mentioned before: security, checks, fields, the extended fields of the dexterity schemas that I had, and so on, without me doing any additional coding and building an API. So here's an example. So earlier you kind of just saw the CMS side of Plone, which is just all those data and fields and so on, like more of a traditional website. But once you export the data, and because I've built this platform using open data standards, we can then do all sorts of interesting things with it. So all those relationship fields of all those people that I've added in Dexterity and added as content in Plone, we can export it using the API into Neo4j. And now I can do visualizations about all who's connected to who owns which companies and whatnot, and do, investigations using graph diagrams. And every time another researcher or a journalist adds a bit of information through the REST API, I can then again sync with the latest information again. Similarly, I could use it. Data journalists also, for example, can extract certain data from it, the CMS, and then do visualizations, for example, like using tools like Flourish. So again, all this data is pulled from the content. And here's another example. Same platform again, and because we have that REST API and because there's a standard schema, the folks at IntelliPro in Kenya and Nation Media Group, they've again used the exact same script, but instead built a React.js and D3.js visualization of the data that they pulled from Plone and Neo4j. So I think that about wraps up my talk. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. So um, so I just want to say thank you for this. And in terms of the additional resources, I think I will share these slides and make it available. So this is the source code, the script for the Neo4j as an example of how, an open source example of how we to extract and use the Plone API to export to Neo4j for relationship types. These are the data standards that I used. They're straightforward schema, and they're all modern standards in JSON schema to implement these things on contracting and so on. And in terms of the Plone add-ons I used, yeah, Plone REST API is built in. There's collective document viewer. Of course, the EA faceted navigation to quickly, show people like what can be searched and so on online. And of course, I had to do some custom code for some of the country and currency codes. I think it's on PyCountry. I'm not sure. There might actually be a working add-on in the collective, but I had to do it quickly, so I just quickly coded my own. And for those, there's links in the presentation that I'll publish that. For those of you who are more interested on the investigative journalism side, on how different people are using how we're using and getting this data, how we investigate it, and as well as other initiatives around using these standards, which are not Plone specific. So yeah, I think with that, I'll just stop this. I think there's some questions, and okay, cool. I think I'm about right on time, right? So about 4 minutes early.
Yeah, perfect. No, thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation. And yeah, we do have one, not so much a question, but definitely Paul wants the Neo4j script that you referred to in your presentation. So thank you for including links to everything. And like I said, that was fascinating and a very interesting use case for Plone. I would encourage everyone to join the face-to-face to continue this conversation if you have any questions or just want to continue the talk. And of course, the Track 2 Slack channel will have stuff as well. And so thanks again, and we appreciate you participating.
Yep, and thanks for having me. Cool. I'll see you guys in either Jitsi and Slack. Right?